All right, it's official. We are live. Hello, everybody. I know people are just starting to sign on now, but hello, my name is Joshua Hatton, which you probably know. Guessing you've been watching some of these and hopefully enjoying them. Hopefully you've remembered my name with ImpEx Beverages, and we've been doing this ImpEx Distillery Deep Dive series that has been just loads of fun for us and hopefully interesting, entertaining, and educational for you guys. I think we're about in the halfway mark to the whole series, and I don't think there's any better person than to bring us to the center of this series than my guest today, and that is Chris Udy of ImpEx Beverages. And Chris is he's going to kill me. I know he's the vice president, but I think he may be like the something in vice president. We'll see if he kicks my ass for not getting it right. But I'm going to bring him on, and we'll be discussing whiskeys from rice produced in Japan. And we'll be talking about that category through the lens of Ohishi and Fukano. So without further ado, let's bring in the good Chris Udy, Vice President and
Director of Firm Handshakes. I want to make sure everyone shakes people's hands firmly after they've met them as soon as the pandemic's over, to let everyone know that they're in good hands when they're with ImpEx.
I like that. There's nothing worse than getting the dead fish. You're just offered this limp. Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, nothing wrong with it, but at ImpEx, it's firm handshakes.
It's a firm handshake. Thank you so much for coming on. Actually, this is the first time. This is the first time I've had a guest where I haven't had to apologize for having them get up at 1 a.m. or 3 a.m, or it's
that's
just
how
5.
That's
What's
how
that?
you know. That's how you know how important the Department of Firm Handshakes is that you have to schedule your time around my schedule, so that I'm not bothered at 1 a.m. or 4 a.m.
I think the next one I should do at 1:30 in the morning your time, but it'd be 4:30 my time. But so we're here today to discuss, and I like this term. You use this term quite a lot. We're here to discuss a slightly newer piece of the whiskey pie, right? Or maybe a different flower in the whiskey bouquet, a new flower in the whiskey bouquet. And that is whiskey from rice out of Japan. This is definitely a new category for a lot of people. Obviously, it's been here. Well, when did you first start bringing in Ohishi and Fukano to the U.S.? What's the history there?
Ooh, I think we started working on the project in 2014, and it took 2 full years of figuring out the compliance side of it, and before we actually were able to bring any in, and I think it was 2016, we brought the first casks across. They left end of 2015 and arrived 2016. I'm not 100% sure on that. I don't really have a concept of time, unfortunately. So, but that's the way that I kind of remember it. But I think we started in 2014 with the idea was there, and we knew it. We had samples and whatnot.
So the project started in 2014. That's when you first discovered this distillate, or did you know about it beforehand? Had you had experience with this in Japan or anywhere outside the U.S.?
No, as it fell into my lap. To be truthful, a friend of mine, Yoshi Murakami, had been importing their shochus into the United States and imported a lot of sake as well. And we were having dinner one night, and he handed me a mini, and he's like, "What do you think of it?" I was like, I think this is great. Where did you find it? And he goes, "Well, it was a Fukano cask." And I'll try, Robert. It's weird for me to read comments as they pop up. I'm gonna try to not. Sorry, guys, I'm not a professional here. anyways, he handed me a mini, and he said it was from Fukano. I was like, you got to bring this in. Like, this is dynamite. And he's like, we can't really do that. And I was like, well, what are you going to do with it? He goes, nothing. I was like, do you mind if I do something with this? He goes, no, go for it. So my wife, who's from the same region, next time we go over there 2-3 times. We used to go over there 2-3 times a year. And when we went the next time, we just went by the distilleries, and lo and behold, I mean, just casks upon casks of aged stock whiskey sitting there, and asked them about it. And they said it was illegal to bottle a shochu. So I was like, well, if I figure out how to bottle it as whiskey, may we have the rights to it? And they said, yeah, sure, go for it. Because it used to be legal to be bottled as shochu way back in the day, but that's a different tale. But for the whiskey project, we saw the cask. It was wonderful juice. We tasted multiple casks to make sure that it wasn't just a one-off. And then we said, okay, off to work.
So when you first tasted that, what was it about the spirit that stopped you in your tracks?
It was, with that particular one, I think it was a 7-year-old New Oak cask, 6 or 7-year-old New Oak cask. And it reminded me of 1970s tax stamp bourbons. So it had really nice oxidation to it. It had a touch of acetone in it. It was like oak all over the place, but then like creme brulee and like really like a big sweetness to it. But it wasn't like anything else that I was tasting currently. So I was just, it was kind of like a piece of history. It's what I knew that I couldn't get anymore unless I drove all around Southern California, hitting the most dingy looking liquor stores I could find, and then maybe find a bottle here, maybe find a bottle there. But it kind of reminded me of that era of bourbon. So I just thought it was really cool. And it was just different than what bourbon is, different than what Scotch is.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It's and I'm sure I paraphrased your term, but I think your term was a good one, where you're just expanding that pie. You're adding more flavors for people to access, and so I want to thank you for bringing it to the U.S. And like that, it's hard work dealing with compliance. This whole new spirit. We spoke with, and by we I mean Jason and I on the podcast spoke with Raj Sabharwal about the issues that he went up against getting Amrut to come in, right? Labeling issues. And I can only imagine, like, at least that is malt whiskey, right? People understand that. This is something from a grain people aren't familiar with. So how long was that time frame of dealing with them? Like a year and a half?
So yeah, it was just back and forth, right? So we got a little bit unlucky in the way that we hit it. That when we first went to TTB, I guess it got shuffled into a different pile, and so we had to go through a lot of hoops for that. Like whenever you submit something to TTB, depending on what pile it goes into, you can either go right through or you sometimes get hung up, and that's just kind of the way it is. Yeah. And we ended up in the pile where you got kind of hung up, and so it, like, going back and forth and making sure we got them the stuff we needed, but we'd have to get it from Japan here to get it to them, if that makes sense. And so it was a little bit of a nightmare, but luckily Helen at ImpEx is very, very good at compliance. She's very good at navigating the bureaucracy, and I forgot what my train of thought was, but it was like, but we got it there. And as far as expanding the pie, I mean, you're dead on, right? Like, I realized a while ago, trying to read blogs, whiskey bloggers, if you know anything about them, if you've ever read a whiskey blog, Joshua, or written one. Tasting notes are regional, right? So you have, I can't tell you how many times I've read in a tasting note marzipan. And I can tell you, as a guy from Georgia, I got no idea what a marzipan is. I tried to buy it once in the UK, and I still haven't quite. Or treacle truffle, or I have no idea. But if I say muscadine,
treacle, yeah,
see, I can't even say it. But but sometimes out of whiskeys, I'll get muscadine, and I doubt folks on the West Coast know what a muscadine is. They might know what like Moscato or something like that, but a proper muscadine from the southeastern part of the United States is its own unique flavor. So Anyway, so yeah, these definitely are an expansion of the pie. And I can't remember what your question was. I hope I answered it.
No, I mean you did get there.
I got close.
Well, no, just discussing the difficulties navigating, and I think you said it right, the difficulties navigating the bureaucracy in TTB to get something moving along.
Yeah. So to add to that, so what ended up working out in our favor was Buffalo Trace had done a bourbon with rice in the mash. Jim Beam had done a bourbon with rice in the mash. Mm-hmm. And as far as the koji side of it, there's a record of koji being used for distillation back in the 1800s in the United States to make whiskey. There's an entire distillery built for the process of using koji to get grain ready for fermentation. So we had that going for us, which was cool. And so when everyone took a step back and looked at the entire process and this has been done here, this has been done there, this is what's being done here, it works. So it worked out. Yeah,
there was a historical precedence for this to be a thing. Yeah.
For a lot of it.
Yeah.
It just took us 2 years to get all that together.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to pour a little Ohishi.
All right. Which one are you having? I'll grab one.
Well, why don't you grab the Ohishi 10-year-old brandy cask if you have it? And so, just so everybody can see this, that is what is being poured right now.
That is a very heavily filtered image there. That's a very pretty blue.
That is a very pretty blue. We can thank Mr. Google for that. There we go. So let's. I definitely want to get into production methods because they definitely differ from what we know, from what we whiskey drinkers know as single malt production, bourbon production, rye production, etc. But before we do, can you take us through this whiskey? Because I know you put some of these whiskeys together. I know with Fukano you put a lot of that whiskey together, and I think with Ohishi, please correct me if I'm wrong, I know you at the very least have a lot of influence as to what the releases will look like.
Yeah.
And so yeah.
In the beginning part of Ohishi, I definitely had a bigger hand than I do now, because we're putting together the vats. We would kind of talk about what we were looking for to present in the glass, and he's kind of got that dialed in now, and it's pretty much hands off. We'll chime in every now and again. So like this, for people who might have multiple versions of the Isla, they might notice the Isla is a little bit bigger than it used to be because it's got a higher percentage of sherry cask put into it than it used to. So we'll still do little tweaks like that from the ImpEx side, where we give a feedback of what our market's looking for as far as like what they're preferring in the flavor profile. But and like with the brandy 10 year that I'm having right now, I'll just tell you, it's not 10 years, it's 10 to 13 years, and some of the 13 year and it's super dark. Like it's, but again, it's to make sure that the best foot is put forward. But historically, Ohishi has always used either sherry cask or brandy cask. I mean, there are a couple of refill oaks here and there, but for the most part, since the 1960s, 1970s, they've always used sherry cask and brandy cask. And in Japan, when they're bottled as shochu, they which has to come out at a different color, right? Shochu can't be darker than basically, like, if you take a bottle of the cheapest Chardonnay and then you add 50% water to it, and then that's like, even then it might be too dark to be qualified as shochu. Or Sauvignon Blanc's even better because that's a lighter color.
Good.
And with these it's a little bit different, but in Japan when they release because they can't have a dark color to it, they shoot for an aroma which comes from the brandy cask mixed with a mouthfeel and palate that comes from the sherry cask, and that's called the Ohishi Gold. And we decided to separate those two out for the whiskey releases, simply because Americans, we know sherry cask, right? It's a historical cask type used in a bunch
Sure.
of different whiskeys, and it's easy for people to understand what's going on there.
Flavors
And
make sense. Yeah.
and the brandy cask, which they're actually cognac barrels, but again, once you start to get into compliance, you don't want to write Ohishi whiskey cognac cask because it just opens up a whole new can of worms. So we label it as brandy cask, and that in and of itself is a super unique thing. And again, the idea behind the project was, you're like you said, the expansion of pie. It's its own unique thing. Like this brandy cask whiskey tastes unlike any other whiskey you can possibly find. Sometimes you might compare it to old Scottish grain whiskey, but it really tastes completely different in the brandy cask. It tastes closer to that in a new oak cask, but in a brandy cask it tastes different. So a separation of those two. Yeah.
So what are the flavors that you or Oisan are looking for when you're creating the 10-year-old brandy, when you're creating the 8-year-old? Let's stay on this. The 10-year-old ex brandy cask.
Yeah. So
yeah.
You want a little bit of, you're going to look for a little bit of rancio. You're going to look for some oak influence for sure, but it's going to be diminished versus other SKUs. You get, Adam from Skurnick said it best, high tone fruit, back when he did his original tasting notes. I kind of never thought about fruit that way, but he said high tone fruit. And it was like, green apples, pears, things that are just a little bit more tart, but at the same time, very salivating. When you take a bite, like your mouth salivates. And so it carries some of that as well, a nice floral quality. And the unaged, the difference between the brandy and the unaged, no age statement, which is actually 8 years, is you have a little bit more of a floral sake component in the 8-year, whereas it's just a little bit darker and heavier on the oak and oxidation in the 10-year. And then overall, you're looking for a mouthfeel. You're looking for umami because these carry a different palate feel to them. Like bourbon feels one way, malt feels another way, and these feel a different way, and it's pleasant like that. Basically, a super dangerous day drinker that'll just get you absolutely shithoused hammer in the middle of lunch if you're not careful.
One of the things that I love about the brandy cask is that it seems almost as if the cask kind of steps back a little bit, lets the spirit character shine through. I think you explained it really well. Like the non-age stated brandy cask one has that real floral, almost sake-like component coming through, and then in the finish, that's when the cognac cask or the brandy cask comes in and just marries with that floral element. And I think it's just a beautiful ride, the flavors.
Oh yeah.
So let's talk about production here, because most people, again, and I'll use single malt as sort of the signpost here, but most people, when they're thinking of whiskey, single malt whiskey, you brew a beer, you distill that beer twice, you put it into cask, 3.5 years later, you've got a whiskey. Fermentation of the fermentation time of that beer is 60 hours, 72 hours, something like that, right? And so it's a fairly short production method, and it's very straightforward. And you've got water, yeast, grains. That's it. Mm-hmm. This, I know, is quite a bit different. And so I wonder if you could take us from grain to fermentation and distillation and on. And let's everybody, all the people who are watching, try to keep single malt in your mind as the road sign here, and then compare it to what Chris is about to explain.
So I've got a great slide on this. Can I share?
Oh, yeah, please.
Sharing is easiest with 2 monitors. I don't know how to share with 2 monitors. Let's see how this works.
Don't pay attention to it. Don't let the man keep you down.
Oh, I don't know if it's going to let me.
No, huh?
Well, it's like asking for some Google permissions and blah, blah. Oh, you know what? That's not what I want. I want to do an application window. I got it.
Okay. All right. I thank all of the viewers here for your patience as the Whiskey Redhead readies his PowerPoint arsenal.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to let me.
All right.
Oh, man, Yudi doesn't know how to do it. Oh, here we go. Let's try it again. Share. It's saying I got to follow some weird-ass steps to do screen recordings, privacy.
Let's just.
Anyways, so the way it works, guys, is accessibility, security, and privacy. So guys, the way it works is it's a 21-day fermentation time, and it's you know what? I got it. Here you go. Oh no, it's gonna make me quit Google Chrome. I'm gonna lose you guys. So the way it works is like this: you have a 21-day fermentation time. You basically take rice and you steam. It's just like with old man working a computer. You're dead on, Elijah. That's right. I'm still. I just figured out where to plug it in at last week. The you take rice and you steam it and you kind of just make a batch of rice, right? And then you'll take that rice and you'll move it over into a clay pot that sits in the ground. And it is and you'll add koji, and then you'll also add well, actually no, you take the rice first, you steam it, and then you add koji to it, and you've got to make your koji rice. So you'll sprinkle your koji seed onto it, which is Aspergillus orgeat, which actually everyone thinks that when you do malting for malt whiskey, you're trying to create sugars out of starches. That's not true. You're changing the cellular structure of the barley into a more fermentable style of starch/sugar. But really what you're getting is an enzyme called alpha amylase. And you need the alpha amylase in the malted barley for the yeast to have a healthy feed onto the sugars inherent in the barley. That's why you'll have malted barley in things like bourbon and things like rye. They'll add a little bit to it to help the yeast kind of kick up and get going. Well, koji gives you that same thing. So it gives you that amylase that the yeast needs to stay healthy while it's feeding on the sugars inherent in the grain. So they'll do a 40-hour process called the koji rice, and then they will then take that koji rice and they'll move it over into their primary fermentation, which, depending on what they're doing, it could be in-ground clay vats or it could be above-ground stainless steel vats, and they'll add water and then they'll add yeast, and that starts to kick off and it ferments for 7 days. And at the end of the 7 days, you have what's called your moromi, which is your primary fermentation. They will then take that primary fermentation and move it over into Travis, people. Then you'll take that primary fermentation, you move it over into a second larger vat, and you'll add a lot more steam rice to it and a lot more water because the yeast is already still alive in the primary fermentation. It'll take on that second batch of rice, and
so
it'll
you're
really
just giving it more food, right?
Exactly.
You're basically giving it more food. Yeah.
Yeah. You're feeding the baby. And then you wait another 14 days for it to 12 to 14 days for it to consume all of that. So at the end of the day, you're at over 21 days of fermentation, and your final ABV before you go in the still is about 16 to 18%, and that's what it is. And so it's extremely long fermentation, and what's so unique about it, you get a few things that are incredibly unique versus other types of whiskey production processes. One is with the rice whiskeys, because of the way it's a combination of the rice doesn't really have any pectins in it, but also because koji helps to get rid of any pectins that might be in the rice. You get a ferment that doesn't have any methanol. So believe it or not, the first drop that comes off the still is consumable. You don't have to worry about a methylated spirit coming off the still.
So just to be clear, is that because of the rice grain or because of the koji or a combination of the two?
Both. So my understanding is both. Now, again, guys, I'm not a chemist, and all of these conversations were had over a lot of beer and whiskey via an interpreter. So, but this is what I get from it, and I'm pretty sure that we're there because multiple interpreters have confirmed it. But basically, you don't have to worry about methanol. There's no heads in Ohishi whiskey or in Fukano whiskey. If you do, like if they were going to be, some distillers in Japan will distill from potato as well. And if you have a batch of potato distillate, we don't use any of that for the whiskey, by the way. But if you do have a batch of potato distillate or a batch of potato ferment, and you think you have more methanol in it than you need, all you do is you just add more koji to it, and that'll take that out. So that says that koji is part of it, but also I know that rice doesn't really have any pectins. So a combination of those two make it to where it gives you that super clean distillate. So you have the super long fermentation time. and you have that super clean ferment that comes out of the back end. And another thing that Oisan will do is he'll only operate 8 months out of the year, because in the summer times he feels that the ferment operates at too high of a temperature and it doesn't give him the final fermentation style that he likes. So he just says, I'm out. We can shut it down. He can afford to do it, and so he just closes production so that he doesn't compromise his ferment or his distillate. And they go out and work in the fields because he's got farms.
Okay. That's awesome. So you mentioned a couple of things there that I want to back up to. You started talking about other producers using potato and for their distillate, and you pointed out we're not using any of that for our whiskey, and that's, I mean, the classification of whiskey, at least here in the U.S., is that it's a spirit made from grain over 40% alcohol, matured in oak, right? So this meets all of that. Had you married this with a potato distillate, then it would have to be something else. So I'm glad you clarified that. But the other part, you started talking about distillation, and as the spirit starts coming off of the still, there are no heads, there is no methanol. Hopefully I'm not going too far ahead, but I know that this is, instead of a double distillation process, it's a single distillation process. And so could you just explain a little further as to why it only needs to be a single distillation rather than a double distillation?
Yeah, I can, but it looks like you're grabbing a whiskey, so I'm gonna grab one too.
I am, yeah. And so we are.
You doing brandy, sherry cask? Hold on.
Yeah, I can do sherry cask. And unfortunately, I don't have the 8-year-old with me. I have an older version, which is the non-age stated, but I guess I'll suffer through it.
So if it's an older version of non-age statement, that could be anywhere from 7 to 10 years old.
Okay. 42.3% alcohol, which is natural cask strength. That's something else that I think we definitely need to talk about here, because these low ABVs across Ohishi and Fukano,
they're handwritten too,
right? Yeah, handwritten natural cask strength. So let's get into the distillation aspect of it here.
Yeah. So basically, so you're the boss here. Can I go into a little bit of the history as well, and then we can dive a little bit deeper and I'll explain the distillation side of it?
You do you, man.
So a 2 times distillation is in whiskeys. It's really to clean up the spirit, right? You do your first distillation, and you get your first run, and then you take that and you run it through again to get a higher ABV, and to get your second run in to really clean it up and separate out the off conagers or the off flavors, whatever you want to call it, to where you can get to the ethanol, which is going to be what you consume. Again, Oisan's kind of doing this on the front end, right? Like they didn't, their distillation practice didn't come from Scotland like ours in America did, or come from Ireland, right? Like distillation came over here from European immigrants bringing it with them from Scotland, from Ireland, from wherever they might have come from, and they would have brought those practices with them. Whereas distillation in Japan goes back, 500 years. The first written record of whiskey is 1494. The first records of distillation in Japan is, I think, 1546 that they can find. And so when you think about that separation of lands and that lack of communication, that they weren't trading partners, so the vocabulary isn't going to transfer, the practices aren't going to transfer. Just the idea of using a heat source to separate out for the ethanol elements out of a fermented compound, they're going to develop their own kind of ways to do it. And on the Oisan side, they realize because their fermentation's so pure to begin with, because they have the koji process, because they have this nice clean ferment, they don't have to clean it up too much for the distillate to be there. And so it's just not necessary. You can do that single distillation, and it comes off the still. It comes off the still, I'm thinking the high 70s, and they run it all the way down to 10. And I don't know if the word is aggregate or average or whatever it is, comes out to be about 44, 45% that would then go into the cask. So it's a little bit lower to start. which is fine, because then when you put it into a cask, you get a lot of benefit from that you might not get at putting it in a higher ABV. You hear in bourbon, they talk about how it's got to go in at 125 or below. And if you're buying bulk bourbon and you're trying to buy a chunk of it, you're buying it at 125 simply because you're trying to condense the amount of space you're taking up and save on wood and, you know, like all of that. You're buying less barrels but getting more liters of alcohol. And then you have some companies like Wild Turkey, I think, until recently, historically, they did 107, and now they may do 104. Yeah, and so they went, and when you ask them why they go lower, they're like, well, sugar extracts sweet flavors, and higher alcohols extract, you know, bitter flavors. And then, but you talk to Scotch guys, and they're like, we go in at 63.5 for convenience of trading casks. So, you know, again, I'm not a chemist, but going in at 45, I know that that water absorbs the sugars out of the oak, and you get that sweeter profile. And so it kind of benefits. So again, when you just historically, you've been doing this historically because the end result was always to have a beautiful distillate out of the gate, and it wasn't necessarily the end result was having something after it matured in oak. Because both of these distilleries that have been around since the 1800s, they sell the new make as is, as shochu, and it's great to drink. It's actually one of the best. It's one of the best highs off alcohol you can have because it's so benevolent. The next day you wake up and it's really clean, so you're not all rusty from it. So when they start to put that in oak, it's just an added benefit of it, right? Because when like new make bourbon's beautiful. I love bourbon. Bourbon was the first whiskey I ever had, and I still drink it to this day. I get tired of it sometimes, and sometimes it whoops my ass, but you know, it's a beautiful spirit. But when bourbon first comes off the still, the new make, the White Dog, it's a pretty gnarly distillate. Like it's pretty aggressive.
Stuff. Yeah.
And they'll put it into those new heavily charred oak casks. And the new heavily charred oak casks, they're pretty gnarly types of casks. Like they can influence whiskey pretty quickly. Anyone that's ever had a new oak Scotch whiskey knows how quickly that influence takes over the malt profile versus a bourbon cask. Like it's pretty apparent. But after years of the two, you know, gnarly forces fighting each other, out comes bourbon, which is a beautiful spirit at the end. With this, it comes off the still as like something really easy to drink, really consumable. So it doesn't need all of that to correct it. It's just more like a simple nudge or a hug or a mild influence on it. So it just shifts it. So it's just a different philosophical approach to distillation, I suppose. Like they're not taking that mindset of we got to do 2 times distilled. We need to make it super high in ABV and put it in an oak, and at the end of it, we're going to have this powerful whiskey. They're like, well, we have a very delicate, beautiful distillate. We're going to take that and let it be manipulated by the oak some, and what comes of it at the end needs to represent the distillery, or we'll do something else with it. Make sense?
So it makes complete sense. You said something there at the end that, you know, something that represents the distillery. And whenever I'm out on, that's funny. Whenever I'm out in the shops and going on the streets and doing tastings, remember when that was a thing? Jesus. Anyway, you know, and I'm showing Ohishi and Fukano. In my head, the thing that separates the two from the perspective of brand identity, or probably better yet, you were right, distillery DNA, is the different casks that each distillery uses. So Ohishi tends to, with their core range, they're focusing a bit more on the cognac casks or the brandy casks and the sherry casks, just like you said. And then they do some other ones, and there is one that I want to talk about in a little bit. But then with Fukano, you know, they're using a lot of new charred oak. They're using a lot of refill oak, and then some wine casks, a little bit of sherry. But it seems that new charred oak element is where Fukano is sort of hanging their hat on. And so with that in mind, do you feel that if these distilleries swapped out the types of casks that they use, that it would change the character overall and people's perception of it?
So it's funny you asked that question. And here's, you know, here's a mistake that I made, and it's kind of a funny one because this still burns me to this day, because if I hadn't done it, I'd be in a I know Sam's watching, and I'm sure I'm going to get a call later about what a dumbass I am, but this is a good one. So I convinced Oisam to buy some new oak casks, and he bought them, and we put some very lightly influenced brandy casks into the new oak casks, and we waited a year. And I went back to try them, and I didn't love them. And I said, you know what? We only bought 5. It was a small amount. Yeah. And I didn't love them. And I said, you know what? I don't know if this is going to work. Let's maybe for us, if you don't mind, let's experiment with some of the other ones, which, like, everything has been dreamy, but how many SKUs do you really need, right? So we discontinued buying new American oak casks. And by the way, you guys should know that oh no. You guys should know that the casks aren't regular bourbon size casks. They're 440 liter casks. So they're exponentially bigger. And to kind of explain what that means is, if you have a 1/2 inch pipe, if you go under your sink and you look, you'll have 2 1/2 inch pipes coming out of the sink, one for cold, one for hot. The cold will eventually join with another 1/2 inch pipe, and it'll then become a 3/4 inch pipe somewhere in the plumbing. And in your head, you're going to think, oh, a 3/4 inch pipe probably carries 1.5 more than a 1/2 inch pipe because it's 3/4 versus half. Well, that's not true. A 3/4 inch pipe carries double the amount of liquid in it than a 1/2 inch pipe, because of the way that math works. And again, I'm shit at math too, but that's the way the volume works. So when you take a 200 liter barrel and you expand that out to a 440 liter barrel, it's exponentially a higher amount of distillate versus the oak that is influencing it. And, and there's something to be thought about there. So this is where the dumbass part came in. So the other thing that some people start talking about, but I wasn't privy to at the time that I made this call, was it takes you a while to get new oak. The new oak influence on a distillate takes a while for it to kind of mold and integrate, and or to kind of integrate into the distillates itself. And as far as Jason goes, yeah, I know math. Shit. So you can sometimes get to it too early. Like I've seen this in a few younger branded whiskeys as well, where they put something in for 6 months and they think it's there, but sometimes it's just not. Like, it's got like this weird vegetal quality to it, or this off tannin to it, and it's simply because they're taking it out of the cask too early. If they had just been patient, that would turn around to produce some sugar, some sweetness, and really integrate and become something beautiful. Now, sometimes it happens really quickly, and at 6 months you have something that's that beautiful, but sometimes it doesn't, right? And in the case of Oisan's casks, I made the call too early, because I come back to the U.S. We decide not to move forward with that. We do we bring in some other alternative style casks. We're working on the finishing, the sakon, and everything that we had done before that. And then I go back to Japan, and the barrel's sitting there, and so I'm like, hey, can I try that again? And it's stunning. Like, it's not just good; it is incredible. Yeah. And I'm like, so about that? He's like, yeah, I sold them. And then he rubbed it in, because he took me to the restaurant where he had sold it, and they had a bottle of shochu, so they ended up having to do the process to where it doesn't have that dark of a color, and they had it in a little yeah, that's exactly it. They had it in a little mini barrel behind the bar, and it's just super high end restaurant, and so we just ended up sitting there and got plastered off that night, and I was like, trying to be cool, but I was just mad at myself for not being patient and saying, no, let's just sit and wait another year. But in my defense, we were still getting to know Oisan, and like he is like, he's a stand-up of man as Sam Filmus is. If you guys have ever met Sam Filmus, he's a man of his word. If he says he's going to do something, he's going to do it, and there is no wavering to that. And that can be for, you get on his bad side, that's on you. But if you're on his good side, it's you've got it. And Oisan is the exact same way. He says he'll do something, he'll do it. So when he said, I'll hold him for you, he meant it. And so I could have waited 5-10 years if I wanted. It wouldn't have mattered. But I didn't realize that at the time, and so I was a little bit panicky, and that Anyway, so now I guess maybe I'll get drunk, call him later, and tell him to buy some more new oak casks, and we can try it in a few years.
Please do. Yeah.
And knowing him, he's probably already done it and just not told me about it, so I wouldn't stress out. So who knows? But anyways, that's so about the new oak cask and about Fukano. Fukano's actually shifted over to the wine cask quite a bit, but
yeah,
whether or not they show the same profile, they don't. The Ohishi and Fukano, while they're both light distillates coming out of the gate, they carry a different signature underneath them. So you would get different, if they were both put in new oak cask, you get a different profile than if they were both put in sherry cask or brandy cask. To make a very easy question super long-winded on the answer.
So what makes their spirit different? Is it the different kinds of rice they're using? Are they using different kinds of koji? Is it a water source? Is it, can you pinpoint it?
They use different types of rice. The Oisan kind of uses, so Oisan will actually distill single varietals of rice, and then he doesn't archive where they go. So a barrel might only have Yamada Nishiki rice in it, but he won't know what barrel that is. He's starting to record that now, but historically he's never recorded it, even though he's done single grains fermentation. So like Yamada Nishiki fermentation, or a Hino Hikari fermentation, or Gohyakuman Goku fermentation and distillation. But at the end of it, he never worried about it because when he was putting things together, all he cared about what the final product tasted like. So those were irrelevant, right?
Yeah.
Those are marketing things. Like if your stuff is good, it's good. But if you want to start marketing it to people who really want to try to dive into it, you want to keep those records, and he's never done it. And with Fukano, I know that they'll use a little bit more Hino Hikari, and they'll use some Gohyakuman Goku, but they'll kind of shift in what they're using, and they don't keep any records whatsoever as far as what's gone into the cask. So the rice would have something to do with it. The yeast strands will have something to do with it as well. Sure. There's 5 different types of yeast that either one of them will use at any given time. Oisan will only use certain yeast strands with certain rice varietals, and I don't know if Fukano-san mimics that. That information isn't privy to us, and it's kind of like you just don't push it because you want to leave some things up to imagination, right? You don't want to take all the fun out of it. I mean, being an anorak's great, but if you know too much, you end up just not enjoying it, and you should just enjoy it. But like if you taste their base spirits clean out of the gate, they have a different profile to them. Oisan's tends to be a little bit more softer, and Fukano-san's tends to be a little bit more bold. I find so that'll influence it as well.
One last question for you about distillation, and then I want to talk briefly on another Ohishi, and then I want to move over to Fukano.
Okay.
So, and please forgive me if I'm not remembering this correctly, but I do recall you saying that Ohishi's still can vacuum distill. And you'd mentioned before that can bring on a softness in the overall spirit character. Does Fukano have the same? Can they also do vacuum distillation?
Yeah, they can. They both have stainless steel pot stills. Oisan, they have multiple stills, right? But like some will be set up as experimental stills. Some are stills that are old and retired, like Fukano started out with an iron still, and then an iron and wood still, and Oisan used to have a wood still. Wow. Like over the decades, they've adopted new technology, and again, this is the vacuum distillation process. I think is technology dating to the 30s, and what it does is if you reduce the pressure on the inside of the still, if you pretend like you're distilling at a higher altitude, it lowers the vaporization point of the ethanol, so you don't have to heat the ferment up to such a high level to separate the ethanol off of the ferment. So it allows you to get a more aromatic spirit, if that makes sense. And so both of them will do regular pressure and reduced pressure distillations depending on what they're going for. Again, the primary business for both of these guys, like the whiskey business is a secondary thing. They've been around for hundreds of years and doing like no age shochus or shochus that have a little bit of barrel influence, but then it's filtered so it follows the laws of shochu, because there's laws that separate what shochu is from, so it can't be confused with whiskey, that were set up to protect trade of whiskey in the 1980s. It's all politics. It's all bullshit politics at the end of the day. But they'll use those methods by which to develop like a new make that shows the profile that they're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, he can do both vacuum pressured and regular pressure distillation. And again, those would go in the barrel, but he wouldn't necessarily, again, he has records of some of them, but not of all of them, because it just wasn't, remember, at the end of the day, everything's based on taste. Like it's
Flavor. Yep.
the math, Jason, doesn't matter. Everything is based on taste. If it tastes good, then it's ready. And if it doesn't, then they sit on it. That's what's great about having, Fukano-san celebrates his 200th anniversary in 2 years.
Wow.
So.
That's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, that distillery has been there so long that the road used to be on one side of it, and it's been there so long that the road is now on the other side of the distillery.
I didn't know roads migrated. Is that a thing in Japan?
It happens every now and again. It's just one of those things.
What do you have the Ohishi Sakura cask?
Yeah, man, I got everything. I got Isla cask too. I'm gonna drink that later.
Yeah, grab the Sakura. Unfortunately, I don't have it, but I wanted to talk about it. Oh, he can't hear me. Look at that. I could say anything. Okay, no, he can hear me now, so I'll stop talking shit. So I wanted to bring up the Sakura cask because, granted, while Ohishi does the Isla cask and they have a port cask, right? And they're doing other sort of unusual casks. I think from a whiskey perspective, those are semi-familiar, where a Sakura cask is definitely not familiar. And so can you just talk about what Sakura is and what it's doing to the Ohishi whiskey, and because I think we're all sold out, and is it going to come back? So
we have Sakura in stock.
We do have Sakura in stock.
Yeah, we have Sakura in stock.
Right. Okay.
We were sold out for a little bit, but we have more in stock. And then when this goes, it might be a little bit of a lull before we get some more, because the Sakura casks, again, it's a type of new oak, right? They're new oak casks, or the new oak casks, but they're new oak cherry blossom casks. So cherry blossom trees is what Sakura translates to in English. And so we're not making the mistake that I made with the new oak cask of trying to go at it too early. We're letting them sit and really develop. And and so there might be a little bit of a lull of that stock, but it's going to be fine. And the cherry blossom trees that he uses it's kind of great, because this for me is an example of the provenance of the south of Japan. The cherry blossom trees are grown just a few miles away from the distillery. Excuse me. And they're felled at 35, 40 years old is when they're cut down, and then they're put into barrels down at Ariake Sangyo, which is in the south of Japan in Miyazaki Prefecture. It's a few hours drive from where Oisun is. And they're great. It's hard to describe the flavor that they add to it we're pretty cut and dry when we talk about tasting notes, like sherry cask or, figs, dates, unsmoked pipe tobacco, leather, blah, blah, blah. Bourbon casks, you always get honey, vanilla, soft oak. With Mizunara, you can always say sandalwood. Like sure. It's just that simple. Mizunara, if a whiskey has been properly matured in Mizunara cask, it'll have a sandalwood quality to it. Yep. If it doesn't have the sandalwood quality to it, then that for me is suspect. And it's just because every whiskey I've ever had that I knew was matured in Mizunara cask, which is, I can count them on one hand, but there's some pretty expensive ones in there. They were all had that sandalwood profile to them. But with Sakura cask, I've yet to come up with the tasting notes. So we talked about, I mentioned the muscadine thing earlier. The best I've ever been able to come up with this is, it smells like when you go to Japan, and if you go to onsen, and you walk into the house, the wood building that was built hundreds of years ago, and you kind of start to get back to where the hot water is, it'll kind of take on that aroma to it. So it smells like a combination of that and the tatami mats, and it takes me as, and again, I'm a foreigner, so over there. So when I walk in, it's new aromas to me that I associate with being there, and it takes me back to that. Or the closest other thing is like an 1800s house in Georgia. When you go into the basement, everything's like perfectly preserved. and it's just kind of like immaculate, and you realize like it's old heart pine, and it's kind of nice. But it's hard to describe, because when you talk about Sakura cask, if you're talking to someone else who knows what it is, you say, oh yeah, it has that Sakura influence or that cherry blossom influence, and they go, oh yeah, it does. But when you try to relate that to food or something, it just doesn't match. Like even with Oisan, if you ask him what the flavor profile is, he'll talk about Sakura mochi, which is a common food for them. So like we might say apple pie for bourbon, right? So he'll say Sakura mochi, and everyone knows what he's talking about. But you say that to a typical American, and they go, say what?
So mochi has something to do with rice, right? It's like a sticky rice.
Yeah, it's a type of rice. So mochi, Oisan will use mochi rice in his fermentation as well. He uses 5 types of rice.
Yeah.
But you guys that are still with us in the comments, you can type, if you've had Sakura cask, any flavor profiles you got would be much appreciated.
Oh,
maybe we can steal them and use them on our sales sheets.
So we got fresh flowers in the grass.
Fresh flowers in the glass. Oh, I thought in the grass. I was like, all right. What type of grass you talking about, Jared?
Jason didn't have any notes, but his point is a good one here. Like that's it, right? It's got to be taste. Let's see if some more flavor notes come up. I want to start talking about Fukano and start highlighting some of their whiskeys, but you were hinting at the late 1980s, right? And the change of laws to shochu, which I think opened the door to these products, here in the 2000s. So you're still working on your Sakura cask. I don't want you to rush. I'm going to pour a little Fukano, but I think that history that you started alluding to is so incredibly important to this category for people to understand it. Because it tells us why this stuff is here and with us now.
Yeah, so what I would say is this. These are not Japanese whiskeys. These are whiskeys from Japan. And it's important to make that distinction, because the term Japanese whiskey really should be associated with the mimicking of the Scotch malt whiskey process that was brought over by Taketsugu-san in the early 1900s, right? Like he went over there, saw what they were doing, and cloned that and brought it back into Japan. And these are different because they're fundamentally made as a distillate of Japan that dates back 500 years, way before that. And so these were originally bottled as shochu. Now, like you said, in the 1980s, there were some law changes. Basically, what had happened was, I don't know if you guys can hear the king, but he's climbing on the couches and taking over the world.
As long as he doesn't say off with his head, I think you're safe.
Hey, Kaito, you want some whiskey? He's thinking about it. So there was a $6 billion trade deficit between the UK and Japan, where Japan was selling $6 billion more worth of goods over to the UK than the UK was selling into Japan. And Margaret Thatcher formed a coalition and went over there to renegotiate to renegotiate Scotch whiskey import tariff. She wanted a reduction on it. And when she did that, she noticed that there was a compromise made. This is where it gets a little fuzzy, but the law that changed was shochu could no longer be bottled in its original color. So like this Sakura cask, just a little bit left, but it still carries this. This is mirrored, so it's like I got to do it backwards. It's too dark to be bottled as shochu now, based on those law changes in the late 1980s. So what you guys are having when you have this is a distillate that was available in Japan in the 1970s and in the 1980s, but then was removed from the market forcefully by politics of trades of two different nations and was basically outlawed.
Wow.
And so when you enjoy a glass of this, you're bringing back a beverage that was available in Japan 30 years ago, but isn't there now. So you're reviving a flavor profile of the beverage categories in Japan. And so they're not Japanese whiskeys, they're whiskeys from Japan, because they basically are whiskeys. So she threw the first shot by making it to where shochu couldn't be bottled at the dark color. Well, okay, so now you don't want it to be that way. That's fine. We'll bottle it for what it is, and that is whiskey. Does it make sense?
It makes sense, But what I find so interesting.
Let me get in front of you there.
Yeah,
To give anyone that's watching the proper historical significance of all of this, like that law changed, and literally in 1989, less than a year later, Nika bought the Ben Nevis Distillery as an investment into Scotch whiskey production in the UK. Because the taxes dropped by so much, they realized that there was going to be business opportunities there. Suntory did the same thing, where they bought a bunch of distilleries in Scotland, and now, as you can see, they're investing in American distilleries as well.
Yeah.
Jim Beam, and and to Mr. Meyer's question about the outlaw bottles, it's weird. People who are part of history historically fail to recognize they're part of history until someone else comes on and say, "Hey, do you realize what you've done?" So, like, you go to the Ohishi distillery. There's not an archive of bottles from the 70s and 80s. I've got one that Oisan gave me as a gift, and it was the oldest bottle in the distillery, and I think it's from the late 80s, maybe the 90s, and it was when things were starting to get inspected a lot more, and they had to start to move the color away, but it was still a pretty dark one because it predates all that. And that was a sherry cask that it's like one of the prize bottles in my collection. But I've never seen any of these old bottles floating around anywhere, but I have one.
Okay.
And I'm never going to open it, of course, but it looks like the ones now. It's nice and dark and pretty, nice sherry influence. Bottled at 38%, if I remember correctly, so they weren't bottled above 40.
Okay.
Because whiskey in Japan, first off, it was labeled as shochu, but whiskey in Japan doesn't have to be bottled at 40%. It can be bottled below. But
is there a minimum?
I don't know. I think I've seen them as low as 37.
Yeah, that number seems to ring a bell. Okay.
But basically, so they did that to separate what shochu and what whiskey were, because she realized there was a confusion of the category there. And without that law change, you can think about maybe shochu would have a different stance in the global drinks market than it does now if it was allowed to continue to be bottled in its original state, straight from the cask, to where it kind of shows. Because it is, I get it's not going to be for everyone. There's some people who just want a lot of oak and for their whiskey to taste like burning, and that is absolutely okay. But there's other people who want a little bit more elegance, a little bit more nuance, to where they have to dig a little bit further into the distillate, and that's what these are for, is to satisfy that. Because, like, for me, I've had thousands and thousands of whiskeys, and frankly, I love them, but you kind of know what you're getting with a lot of expressions, and these were the ones that kind of flipped me on my head and had me really thinking when I need to think about what whiskey is to me.
So let's transition over. There's some questions that are popping up, but I'm going to tend to them a little later. So Bill Myers, Elijah have some really good questions, but let's quickly discuss Fukano.
Oh yeah. So I've added that. So if you hate it, you can send all your comments to office@impexbev.com. Helen will get them, and she'll remind me about them every day when I do something wrong in the office, and I'll be totally deserving of it. And if you love it, send those same comments there, so that she will sit there and have to shake her head as she sees my head get bigger and bigger and bigger. So that is a combination of new and used oak. That's got 10 to 12-year-old whiskey in it, and it's basically, that was it's a heart to those 1970s tax stamp bourbons, but a little bit lighter. So think of it more like a 40-year Ember Gordon, or like an Old Taylor from the 70s.
Okay. Yeah, no, those are pretty good signposts, but
maybe not Old Taylor, because that had a raspberry note to it, and the Fukano. Well, I guess that the Fukano 2020's got a raspberry note to it, but that might be more like Old Forester actually, or Old Crow. But yeah, new and used 440-liter casks, and touch of coconut. Like, it's great, and that's another one where that was planned out. That was planned out when some of those casks were 8 years old and other ones were 12. So that was actually a vatting of, I can't remember how many casks now, but it was all of that was predetermined. I want to say was predetermined almost 4 years ago, and then parceled out with the anticipation of how each one was going to mature and how it was going to come together. And we got 96 points Ultimate Spirits Challenge, so yay.
I know. No, it really is a brilliant whiskey, and I've used this. I've used the 10-year-old, the 14-year-old, and surely some of the 12-year-old single casks. And I'll blind pour them for people, and they think, where'd you get this dusty bourbon, right? Where did this weeder come from? Oh, it's got to be, and they'll throw some names out there. It's remarkable how well this fits into that dusty / weeder bourbon silo.
Yeah, it's fun, right? And the 12-year-old cask, those were, I think we've done 12. We allocated 12 of that, and basically they were all like just super rich in oak, except for one. One wasn't, and I'm not going to say which one. You got to get all 12 to figure it out, but I know which one. They were all like super heavy-handed in oak, and they were just completely unique, and there's no way to improve upon them, right? Like when I added them to something else, it either diminished the something else or it diminished them. And so to bottle them as their own is the only way to do it, because they're their own unique thing. So we did a 14-year like that too, Joshua. I don't know if you know, but we did some black label unaged statements. And cask GRC 49 is actually a 14-year-old that Sam and I we actually, I don't think we made any money on that cask. I think we might have taken a little bit of a loss because of the price of it versus the price we sold. We just snuck it in there for fun, because when we did that, it came out when some of the Fukano purple labels were coming out, the 12-year purple labels. And even though it fit the 12-year thing, it was so different from any of those. We didn't want to worry about consumers. You want consumers to kind of know what they're getting when they're getting it. And with single cask, there's going to be variations, but when with that, we're not really harping on the variations like you guys at Single Cask Nation would. So it was kind of expected that they would be similar to each other. And that one was just such a wild dog that we bottled it up as the black label and released it. It's one of my favorites. I have that open in the cabinet now, and I drink it regularly. I'll be sad when it's gone.
I'm trying to think if I have that. I don't think I have that.
I think a chunk of it might have gone to, I don't know where we sold it even. Sam could tell you. But yeah, GRC 49 is a 14-year-old Fukano, and a refill. I think it's like a second or third fill sherry cask maybe, but it's got this weird fruit thing going on. It's nice.
So Jason just asked a question, and it was right around the line of questioning that I was going to touch on. So let's bring this up. And looking at Fukano 10-year at 40.3%, do you have casks that drop below 40 and then get blended in with higher ABV casks?
For those, I don't. Hold on, I'll tell you. I'm gonna have another Ohishi. I made the Fukanos. I know what those are. So, and I love them. And I'm gonna drink them later. But I drink them a little too quick, and I'm not gonna keep it together. So, yes. With the 10-year, I think that everything was, but the lowest it got was maybe 39.7 or 39.9, and there weren't many of them. Again, it's like the math. Jason, here you go with math again. This is your MO today. But when you need to bring something up in ABV, it takes you twice as much volume as you would think it would to get it back up. So if you go down, it's tough to get back up. So most of those, almost all of them would have been above 40, and then just maybe one or two would have been below. But most of them were above. Now, this one, the Tokubetsu Reserve, again, the mirror.
Gosh.
Yeah, this is. I'll tell you guys about it real quick, because it's almost equal parts 27-year-old distilled in 1974, 7-year-old and 10-year-old, and they'll always be first fill sherry casks. And the 7-year-old is supposed to be a little bit of the oak spice in the front of the palate. The 10-year is the mid palate and in the fruit, and then the 27-year-old from Oisan's birth year, 74, which his father made for him, is the weight in the back of the palate and like this heaviness. And so 2 generations of distiller, but that 27-year-old went into stainless, just like A.H. Hurst's 16-year from 1974 went into stainless years ago. So just to kind of stop it, they did the same thing with this at 27 years, because the casks were not holding up the ABV. Now, there are some stocks in Oyson's warehouse that are 25, 27 years old at 43%. There are some stocks at Oyson's warehouse that are 13 years old and they've dropped down to 38%. It's just the way a cask is. And you know, you see this all the time. I mean, you guys have bottled I think you guys have bottled basically a flamethrower in a barrel. One of them was like 65 or 67%, or you had one almost at 70, didn't you?
Well, we have one. Yeah, we did. And we have one we're about to release at 67.6. So yeah,
there you go.
Throw in a
hazmat material. I mean, it's going to be awesome, but you see what I mean? Like the ABVs and casks can really go all over the map. And so this stuff, I think, dropped to between 38 and 39. So that's why it's only a third of the 1974 distillate. That is used because it takes twice as much to get it back up to the 40.5, which is where the first 2 batches of Tokubetsu Reserve were bottled at, and the current one's at 41.2. So, you know, we would have loved to have done a 1974 vintage Ohishi, right? Like it would have been god awful expensive, but we totally would have loved to do one, but it's just not in the cards. Now, the 25-year-old stuff, the 26-year-old stuff, that's, you know, spoiler alert. I don't know if it's an ImpEx thing. I can say whatever I want because it's anyone who's here is with ImpEx. So we pretend it's like a family meeting. Those are actually older than that, but he doesn't have the records. So they might be as old as 30, 32 years old, but the records are stopped at, I think, 27 years ago. So some are 25, some are 27, but he thinks that they're actually closer to 30 or 31. But because we can't, like, we're only going to say what we can prove, so that's what they're going to be bottled at. And that's in those have been moved over into 75-year-old sherry casks. So they held sherry in them for 75 years, and because they carry that old style Macallan Rancio note on them, so it's not a sherry conditioned cask, but a proper sherry, and we're letting them sit for right now until they're ready.
Ooh, oh gosh, that makes me a little nervous. Sherry casks like to eat alcohol.
Maybe, you know, he'll make sure to test it quite a bit. But you know, sherry casks like to eat alcohol now because really they're sherry conditioned casks, right? Like they're 2 to 5 years sherry in them, and then they're putting other distillate in them, so they're still pretty young. Like after 75 years, it's just a flat vessel. Like you're going to lose some alcohol because the influence of the sherry coming into it, right? And that's a lower ABV, so that's going to bring some of it down. But for the most part, like that vessel's, it should, if it held sherry for 75 years, all the leaks have been filled with sugars. It's just going to be good. Don't worry, Chicago will get some, Ford.
And then we, I don't know if I put this question up here. Yeah, you know what? This is an important question that's been happening.
Elijah.
He's naughty. He's very naughty.
So Elijah, you would be happy to know that this was a conversation that Joshua and I actually started talking about 2 days ago. Yeah. So the problem now, and the problem is what it is, right? Is that the olive oil is not making its way from Japan to the U.S. Mail isn't coming from Japan right now because we're so great at handling our pandemics. So we're not getting I can't get samples in, and normally I bring them in my suitcase, but I'm not. I haven't been since I was supposed to go. I've already missed 2 trips, I think, to Japan at this point. So it's and I'm not going in December when I normally do, and that's normally when I grab a bunch of cast samples and bring them back. So we're working out on how to get some cast samples here, and as soon as we do, Jason and Josh they'll have a go at them, and then it's a matter of working out some other logistics. But expect them in 2029.
Some breaking news. Now come back to us when we've all turned 50. So I'm going to switch up. Hold on. Here we go. gonna switch up the Fukanos.
That would have been a great opportunity for me to say, yeah, we tried that, Elijah, but Jason said the math didn't work.
Right, and that's why we let him stick with philosophy. I'll do the math. So Fukano
the Vault 2. Okay.
Yeah, and so let's talk about Vault 1 and Vault 2, because I think the two have a somewhat similar story, but the end products are quite different.
Yeah, hold on. Let me get some Vault. I want some Vault 2 with you. I'm just making a vat over here that I'll drink at the end. By the way, they blend well together, everyone.
Ooh, do they? Okay. Well, I currently have I've got the Vault 1.
So Vault 1, you got Vault 1 and I've got Vault 2. So Vault 1 has got a little bit of sherry into it. So guys, if you were very much into nerdy whiskeys, this is the one for the Anorak. So basically this is, let me see if I can pull up my notes here. This is the one. The Vault series were a series of, there was 4 actually. There was Vault 1, mirror, Vault 1, Vault 2, the G-Con, and the Fukano 6000. Fukano 6000, the art was done by Lindo. We did the Fukano G-Con where the art was done by a guy a local artist out of Hideyoshi. And then we did the Vault 1 and Vault 2. And Vault 1 and Vault 2 are pretty similar. There's a little bit of the same whiskey in both, not much. But Vault 1 had more sherry influence. And you're tasting it now, and you might notice the slightest hint of gunpowder on the back of the nose.
100%. Yeah.
That is because there was a single gunpowder cask in there. So like you guys know in the I say this because anyone who's still on here has drank a whole bunch of malt whiskey. In the early 90s, we saw a bunch of casks that came out that had a gunpowder aspect to them, where basically they were almost like sulfured whiskeys. We saw it with some Glenfarclas single finest, Bayside's finest distillery single casks. We saw it with there was a Chieftain's Rosebank that had it. There was a bunch of casks that had that to it, and there was one Fukano cask that had it to it as well. And I loved it. It was great it was great. Go ahead.
It's not connected. I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's the gunpowder cask that you're referring to, and you're right, man. This is getting as geeky as it gets, but they're not connected to the Paxaret. The Paxaret sherry casks were a different animal. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yep. Okay.
These go back to the mid '90s, and that gunpowder cask I think is a. Let me look. I think the gunpowder cask is a 2000. It's either a 2011 or a 2013 vintage. So it's way past all that. But in the mid 90s, you had a bunch of them, and then there's still ones that creep up every now and again. And so I didn't like bottling as a single cask could have been off-putting to a lot of people because it's a very limited skew of whiskey drinkers that like gunpowder casks. Just like there's a very limited skew of whiskey drinkers like Bromore FWP casks. However, they seem to be multiplying in recent years, and I don't understand it. If you love those, I know a guy who can get you some. He's on the screen here. I think it's insane. But so the Vault 1 was it has 1,200 more liters in it than Vault 2. So I think it's like Vault 1 was just over 5,000 bottles. Vault 2 was around 3,800 bottles. And it's because of that one gunpowder cask. Well, that gunpowder cask is just a few hundred liters, but I had to add an extra 800 and something liters to it to absorb it to the point where it wasn't a punch in the face, but rather a kiss at the finish. Does that make sense? So 100%. The Vault 1 has a little bit more sherry cask influence to it. It's a combination of distillate all the way from 2000, like it's 950 liters of 2013, 700 liters of 2011, 2,400 liters of pre-2002. So like multiple ones going back into the 90s, and then 950 liters of 2002 to 2011. Now, some of these were still in cask, and some of these actually went into tanks, and they rested. So a fun thing about this is 8 of the casks that went into Vault 1 had been moved into tanks, and then those 8 casks were refilled back in 2002, and they became Vault 2. Does that make sense?
Oh, wow. Yeah, it does. Yep.
So if you want to, this is the nerdiest whiskey that was ever done, and the Vault 2 is a completely different profile. It's it doesn't have any of that. It's like it's like got a little bit of melon. It's got a little bit of lychee fruit, I don't know, but a whole different animal. That stuff was 1,200 years of 11 years from 2002 to 2013, where then it went into tank. We had 157 liters of 6-year-old and 255 liters of 8-year-old, and then there was actually 180 liters of 3-year-old. So we actually vatted 180 liters of 3-year-old with 1,200 liters of 11-year-old. Just because it worked. It worked. Like it was one. Yeah. I mean, it was a mad scientist project in over a few weeks in different hotel rooms where I was taking all these samples and vatting them together to establish the vaults. And the idea and what they simply were and what Fukano is always going to be, and you can love it or hate it. I kind of don't care. But I'm happy if you love it. And if you hate it, like I totally understand why. But that's the push of the envelope of what whiskey can be. So like those bringing back the 1970s tax stamp bourbon flavor profiles, but at the same time pushing into straight up powdered sugar and rock candy, like the Fukano editions are, or like super amplifying the sake-esque of Fukano whiskey, which was a 2017 version of the Fukano release, or with the Vault 1 and Vault 2. Vault 1, like having this a little bit of sherry influence, but a kiss of gunpowder at the end, but like this nice roundness to it, to the Vault 2, which is like creme brulee and and lychee and super soft and light.
I missed that 2017 edition. That was all blue cheese and bananas for me. It was delicious.
So it's great. Like, absolutely. It's all we want to do, and it's ImpEx's modus operandi, right? Like everything we've ever done is an expansion of what whiskey can be. Like glorifying whiskey from Wales, glorifying whiskey from Israel, like making sure proper Scotch whiskey distilleries are represented, the independent bottlers, everything. It's just an expansion of the offerings, because we're not a big company. We just really dig our whiskey, as everyone can tell by what's over your right shoulder. If you drank that, man, that's enough ounces there. You could stay drunk till you're 80 and you wouldn't finish them all.
Yeah, and then you haven't seen the other side. The shit in my basement.
You got to get a fisheye. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Mine's all boxed up in the office. I'm glad no one's come to visit me recently, because they would just be like, "What have you done to this place?"
We had a really important question come in here from Travis Williams. Where is it? There it is. Curious of the age statement on the fro. Joshua is here.
I was wondering that the other day too, because I clip mine. I go in with the clippers, and the back might be a mountain range, but who knows?
Yeah, this is for March, right? There you go. I'm going to see what happens. I'm just going to let my freak flag fly and see if it grows bigger and higher and closer to God.
You got to pick it out.
So you got to pick it out.
Yeah. I think so. And then stay off of these streets. Fletch.
Fletch. It's great. I haven't thought about that in a long time. Let's quickly talk about. There's one more Fukano I want to talk about, and then there are some other questions that came in, and this one is the 2020 edition. So I know that.
So that's got a chunk of red wine cask in it. So Fukano is he's shifted. He doesn't have so much new oak cask anymore. He's got some sherry cask, and he's got a lot of wine cask, red wine casks running around the warehouse. So that had some more of that in it. And I can't remember. I want to say there's a little bit of younger stuff in there as well, and there's a little bit of stuff over 10 years old in there. And it's a combination of refill sherry, refill oak, and some first fill red wine casks. And I dig. I'm really happy with the way that came out. That took and so there's other casks that have been set aside. So again, it's from a parcel of casks where I guess some of those 2019, 2020 Fukano releases are akin to each other in the way that they're done. They're meant to taste different. No Fukano edition is ever meant to taste the same. It doesn't have to. But casks are selected like in 2019 that are parceled out for 2020, and some in 2019 are parceled out for 2021 and 2022. And the same thing with the 2020. Like we retried them and we decided to go with this, and some ones are still waiting. And to say that we're waiting for them to be ready is a false statement. Some of them are already ready. We're just saving them to make sure that they are like, it's not needed. You don't always have to add honey to whatever you're making. You can just stop adding honey if the recipe's done, right?
What would you say is your you go grab your whiskey and then I'll ask the question.
I want some of this too. What would I say is my what?
What would you say is potentially the biggest obstacle for this category when trying to introduce drinkers to it for the first time?
I will be completely open and candid about it. The biggest obstacle to this category of whiskey is that Americans have a fundamental flaw, and that we look at everything through our own lens. We look at everything as Americans, and that's I love us. I love our country. Like I'm one of us, but we tend to go into places and immediately think that it should be Americanized when that's just not the way it is. They take a Western view and use that to look at a Eastern product, right? So, in America, we use a lot of salt. We use a lot of sugar. We use a lot of like fat in our cooking. And in Japan, they use a lot of dashi. They won't use so much sugar. It's more of like a balance of everything and built from the center out. And sometimes it's hard for some folks to embrace that. They have a notion of what whiskey is supposed to be. And when it deviates from that, it takes them out of their comfort zone. Now, I need to make sure that I say that they're absolutely right in feeling that way. They're allowed to feel that way. Like whiskey's a very personal thing, but I think it's meant to bring people together. But I also think it's meant to be explored a little more than what's historically been done. And this is just an exploration of it. Like I'm very much a fan of distilleries that are using mesquite to smoke their whiskeys. I'm very much a fan of, alternative casks, alternative grains, alternative yeasts, and alternative like fermentation times, distillation methods, like using a full-on beer wash with hops in it to distill that and clean it up. Like we're at a very unique time. I'm old enough to remember sneaking into bars as a teenager and seeing only Bud and Bud Light and Mick and like MGD, and if it was a fancy bar, they might have Red Hook or Amberbach or Shiner Bock. That was the craft beer, right? And
Shiner.
Now,
yeah.
And now you go into places and the options are limitless. They'll have some local stuff. They'll have some stuff from overseas. They'll have some guys that are doing this and doing that. And I'm personally ready for whiskey to go down that same road because it's just the category of it is something that can really like it's booming, right? And it's well deserved that it's booming. Bourbon is awesome. Scotch whiskey is awesome, but it's also like it should be a rainbow of flavors. Like Skittles that bitch out, man.
Yeah. Yeah, we someone had, people always say interesting things on the internet, and someone had made some comment. Someone had posted a picture of an Ohishi and said, I need to get a bottle. I don't have a bottle. It's terrible. And someone had posted a picture of an Ohishi and saying, debating, should I get it? And most of the comments were encouraging. Some people didn't understand what it was. And one person said, and I thought his comment was really interesting. He said, just know that it's from rice. If you're okay with that, then give it a go. And
that's a perfect comment.
I think it's a flawed comment.
Why? I think it's fine. Like it is from rice. If you're okay with it, give it a go. If you're not, take your racist ass on home.
Okay, maybe it's not flawed, but I think the approach to the outcome is one that I wouldn't take. Right, where he said, it was almost like a, let me throw up the caution sign, right? Right? Like, slippery when wet, just watch out. If you're cool with that, then go ahead and do that. And me, it would be, give that a go. That's going to be different. That's going to be new, right? And the worst that can happen is you don't like it. You've made a bad decision. We've all made bad decisions, but maybe you can gift it to someone, a friend, share it with people, and maybe they do like it. But at the end of the day, I think the answer is give it a go. But I pause a little bit when they say, watch out though, it's from rice. Like, no, it's from rice. That's kind of exciting. Like when the world was a normal place and I would be behind a table at a whiskey show pouring Penderyn for people, and I'd say single malt Welsh whiskey, the response is, ooh, what's that? That's interesting. That, I think, is the approach that a whiskey drinker should have. And
I would love it if they have that approach, but I'm a little bit more old and jaded and cynical, and like, I'll tell you, and anyone else who hasn't turned out yet, I remember when Sam and I would go in 2007, I think we were selling a 17-year-old Linkwood single cask, 46%, and the wholesale on it was $37.50.
Mm.
And that was it was like a mid-price one. We even had stuff that was cheaper. We were trying to shift Port Ellens, and I'm not going to go into what we were trying to shift those for, and everyone was looking at us like we were crazy. They're like, no one's going to drink this Linkwood. No one knows what it is. Get out of my store. And we were struggling trying to sell it. Like, it was
amazing.
I mean, we were on the hustle, like a lot of hours on the street trying to make sure that we could get this single cask of Linkwood onto shelves. And everyone says, no one drinks that. They only drink Johnny Walker. And, okay, cool, man. Like, yes, you're right. Like, you would hope that they would say, yeah, go for it, try it. But instead they said, well, you should know it's not a Macallan. It's like, nope.
No, right, and that's
neither were them Ardbeg dumpies that were Signatory was selling for $65 retail that are now worth $4,000 a bottle. You snooze, you lose. But
exactly.
But yeah, you're right. Like, I would hope that people would go for it and try to embrace it. But at the same time, if someone's dead set in their ways, then it's fine. Someone's got to drink the really buttery Chardonnays and with, like, it's fine. And other people are going to drink natural wines that are super high in acid and kind of funky.
Yeah.
Everyone each their own.
So I'm going to throw a question up here, but I'm going to tell him he's denied, and you'll see why. So this came from Elijah. Can you address the bullshit, whatever that English word is, Japanese whiskey chart that everyone uses when discussing Japanese rice whiskey? So I guess we can and should touch on that, but I think that whiskey chart may play a slightly bigger part of the conversation when we meet again in 2 weeks and we're talking about Japanese pure malt. But I've seen that chart. Like, how do you feel rice whiskey fits into that discussion?
Again, man, like, people like to find things to gripe about. That's another American thing, by the way. We like to bitch and moan. We like to find things that we don't like and write about that because it brings more attention. You see it in TV shows. Like, if you look at how Gordon Ramsay's represented in American TV versus UK TV and the difference of it, or like a baking competition, the difference between the two. Like, in the UK, it's a lot more of a supportive TV show, whereas in the US, it's a lot more of a drama TV show.
Yeah,
Americans like drama, and so there are people who like to try to stir the pot and muckrake and create a lot of drama, and it's just not. It's just silly because when you, and we'll talk about it in 2 weeks, and hopefully everyone will come back. But when you take a look at the history and you take a look at the reality of what the category has historically been, it's a different thing. And when you take a look at what these are, like, these are based off of 500 years of distilling practices in Japan. You got a problem with it? I mean, 5 centuries says you're wrong. So I don't know what to do about it. Like, the guy who pioneered the koji process in whiskey was given a 4th Order of the Rising Sun by the Emperor of Japan. What other validation do you need? Like, that guy single-handedly took his company from, in 1 year, in 1892, with the Koji process, was able to take his company in 1 year from nothing to a $10 million valuation. $10 million, 1892, whatever that is, inflation now. It's simply because he was the first guy who realized that Westerners weren't using Koji for fermentation. Oh, and by the way, that same guy who said Koji's cool for whiskey got out of the whiskey business because people tried to not pay him for his process. Ends up discovering the adrenal gland and crystallizing the adrenal gland from horses, him and his assistant, and revolutionized modern medicine. So, it's...
Yeah.
I don't know. Let's see what happens. 20 years, they'll look back and they'll say, yeah, ImpEx was a bunch of dumbasses. They'll look back and say ImpEx was a bunch of geniuses. But, we've been around since, I think, 2008. We're still growing.
Yeah.
Turnover is almost nothing. I think we're doing all right. So one little chart, I ain't worried about it.
So
if you guys see that chart, do your history. Like, don't believe what bloggers say all the time. Bloggers are great, but they're not always right.
Yeah. And yeah, we definitely need to bring that up in a couple of weeks. We've hit our limit, but there were a couple of questions here that I wanted to tend to, and let me just find them because they were a bit earlier on.
I'll answer them as fast as I can.
Okay, where are they? Here we are again. Here we go. Well, this one's just funny. that is a very important question, but that wasn't what I was looking for.
Thank you for the kind words, Elijah.
Oh, jeepers creepers! I can't find it.
It's okay, as you're not looking for it. We can walk it off with this, right? Like, thank you for those kind words, Elijah. I'm from Georgia before, and I'm from Athens. The state, not the country. That's a
and not Athens, Greece.
Not Athens, Greece, or Athens, Ohio, or Athens, Mississippi. I think there's one there. Athens, Georgia, home of the Bulldogs. And
I had one last question for you.
Go ahead.
Oh shit! Really quickly, Dan Pate brings up a really good example here. That's perfect.
Yeah. So
right?
What the quote, like my comment on that is, what would they be calling the Pennsylvania Ryes had they not been made from people coming over from the U.S., right? If they didn't have, the vocabulary of whiskey had not transferred in with the people that brought the technology, what would be the name for Pennsylvania Rye? Is it like, when you really look at it, it's a different product. You don't ever confuse whiskey and rye whiskey, but we call it whiskey simply because that was the vocabulary that came over with the technology, and the technology in Japan predates the vocabulary trade.
And to that point, you can imagine, right? People leaving Scotland, Ireland, coming to the U.S. to produce whiskey. Wait a second, barley isn't readily available. What is? Corn, rye. Were they back then saying, how are they making whiskey out of those grains that don't make sense, right? It's an evolution.
Well, look at it in fundamental vocabulary, right? Like the word bread. Every language has a different word for bread. Ironically enough, in Japan it's pan, and in Spanish it's pan as well. But they all, because the technology predates the trade of the vocabulary. If that makes sense, or it's evolved beyond that over years and years. But when you say computer, that translates into most languages.
Because it's a modern word.
Because we were all communicating with each other and trading with each other when the technology was developed.
Yeah.
And so in the US and in the UK, we say the word whiskey because we were trading with each other, like by way of manpower, when the technology was brought up, after the technology was brought up. Or auto, like automobile, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But the distillation in Japan and the distillation in UK formed around the same time, but it did it before vocabulary was being traded between the two, because they didn't learn it from each other; they learned it from a third party.
Right, and it's such an important point. The Japanese, because it was a closed society, didn't have access to the word uskaba, which became whiskey. Right, the nomenclature was different, regardless of the fact that both are distilling a grain product.
Yeah. So what I wanted to walk it off with about Elijah's comment, if there's no other questions, is, again, the biggest thing I can harp on is I love Scotch whiskey. I have hundreds of bottles of it. I love bourbon. I have hundreds of bottles of it. But I also love rice whiskeys, and I have hundreds of bottles of it. Like, you don't drink lager every day. Sometimes you want IPA, sometimes you want stout, and that's, like you said at the very beginning, it's an expansion of the pie. And I think that everyone who does try it, like, again, if it's not for them, it's not for them. But people who do try it, if they give it an honest chance, they'll find it creeps under their skin. It's just like a sour beer, where the first time you have it, you're like, whoa, what am I doing here?
Yeah.
But then you really crave them, and you start to get into them. And so, it's a nice thing to have on the shelf, because you'll find that you'll go to it more often than not if you do have one on your shelf.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Good.
Everyone.
There is one last question from Brian, and I've seen his last name 100 times, and I've said Vital and I've said Vitali, and there you go. I don't know, but it says, here you go, non-whiskey related question, because I love Japan so much and was traveling there 2 to 3 times per year pre-COVID. What is the habitual thing you would do as soon as you would get to Japan?
It's funny, because the most habitual thing I do is I go to the vending machine and I'll buy a bottle of green tea out of the vending machine. And then I'll go to the convenience store and buy a kombini onigiri, which is a little rice thing, because they sell the little rice snacks over there. That's the most habitual thing I do.
So funny.
But if you're in Japan, like, just remember you're in their land. So let yourself go and explore what they're doing, because the cuisine is incredible. Like, and it's regional. So depending on what part of the country you're in, you're going to get different cuisine, and you're going to really tamalo sando curry pan. Yeah, get curry pan, which is basically bread with curry on the inside. You guys are going to love that as well. It's just, basically, you can go to a convenience store, you spend like $20 or $30, and you can drink anywhere you want. So you buy a can of beer, but there's a malt tax in Japan, so beer is more expensive than like fake beer. You can buy fake beer, or you can buy what they're called as chuhais, and they're basically like flavored vodka sodas, and they're really good too. So you can just go to a convenience store and spend about $20-$30 and just try a whole bunch of different things, and they're crazy.
That sounds fantastic.
I recommend that for somebody just getting into Japan, because you're not going to. But the other thing you really want to do, guys, is if you go over there, spend one evening and go to a kaiseki place, because like here in the United States, a kaiseki place will be quite expensive. Like, we have Ennaka in LA, which has got 2 Michelin stars. You can't get a reservation. If you get in there, it's like $300-$400. But you can go to kaiseki places in Japan, which do really good kaiseki, like little mini dishes, and it's like $30-$40. Super cheap.
Okay.
And eat sushi as well if you eat meat, because sushi is also really cheap over there. You go to the grocery store and you buy Toto for like $7, which is the belly of the tuna.
Wow. Okay. All right. Well, Chris, I think that ends our session. Oh yeah, I need to. I need to. What is the? Is kanpai the official toast?
With an N. Kanpai. Kanpai.
Kanpai, not kanpai. Kanpai. Okay.
Kanpai.
Kanpai.
Or you can say, you also say, well, Kaiten does it. Cheers, pros, zdrowie, like slancheva. It all works. There's another great example. Cheers predates the vocabulary, right? We're all celebrating with each other before we were trading vocabulary, which is why we all say it different. So, anyway.
Well, regardless of what the salutation is, thank you. I really appreciate all that you've shared, all of your knowledge, your transparency, which has been fantastic, and I think will be required again in 2 weeks. So I'm gonna love you and leave you.
Lakida.
And yeah, there you go, Yakida. Do you ever see? I'm sure you've seen. Really quickly, you've seen Django Unchained.
Oh yeah, I just watched it again the other day. It's a great movie.
I watch it nonstop. But there's a part when they're with Monsieur Candide, and the German guy says, they're all toasting, and the German guy says Prost, and Leo DiCaprio says German. I love that. Absolutely love that. All right, Chris, thank you so much. I'll see you, or we will all see you in 2 weeks. And it's been brilliant. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, man. Thanks for all your hard work. Talk to you soon.
All right, cheers, man. Thank you. All right, lovely. Absolutely lovely having Chris on here. He's such a fountain of knowledge, and I think delivers the information in a very digestible format, but at the same time a really geeky format. I think it was Travis who would really love the geeky aspect. So hopefully you guys will come back in 2 weeks, where Chris will be discussing some of the Matsui brands, basically an exploration of single malt, pure malt, and blends in Japan or from Japan through the lens of the Matsui blends. But that's in 2 weeks. Next week, we will have Ollie Chilton, who is the master blender of Port Ascaig. And so he'll go over his blending processes, the history of Port Ascaig, what they've done to create their different expressions. And that'll be just good fun. If you know Ollie Chilton, you'll be happy to be there. If you don't know Ollie Chilton, you'll be happy you came. We love Ollie so much. We're going to have him back for... Oh, wait. Hold on a second. Oh, look at this. I'm gonna bring Chris back. Look at this. Chris, I gave you a wrong date. I gave other people the wrong dates. So you're coming back on December 9. Not in 1 week, but you're coming back in 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's what you said.
Did I say 2 weeks?
You did, but I think it's more than 2 weeks, isn't it? December 9th. 3 weeks.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, it's 3 weeks. It is 3 weeks.
4 weeks. 4 weeks. I'm coming back.
Remember this math we were talking about? Anyway.
Yeah.
All right. Just so we're clear. Okay. All right, I'm going to kick you back off. So November 18th, we'll have Ollie Chilton with Port Ascaig. On December 2nd, also Wednesday, we're bringing Ollie back to discuss single malts of Scotland, independent bottling category. This is great. Dan Pate saying new math. That is most definitely the new math. And Travis, yes, the wheels have come far off. And then on December 9th, then we bring back the Whiskey Redhead. That's when we're talking Japanese single malts, Japanese pure malts, and Japanese blends. And then finally, on Wednesday, December 16th, I'll be bringing Jason Johnston Yellen in, who is my business partner with Single Cask Nation, and I will be interviewing him. He will teach us about our company. Should be good fun. Everybody who's joined on, thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure these past few weeks doing these events, seeing some familiar names, seeing some new names. And I look forward to seeing you in the next 1, 2, 3, 4 events. All right. Cheers, everybody.